Welcome to our book club.
So we're doing Heatwave, and we today we shared all of our thoughts on like a Google Doc. So if we're referring to my computer, it's just because we wanted to kind of outline the things we wanted to talk about today.
So we're gonna start with the introduction in the first chapter.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, we thought that like the introduction did a really good job at outlining
Summarizing,
just what was gonna be in the following chapters. And we like picked out a couple of quotes that stood out to both of us.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to read the first one?
Yeah, sure. So because when I first saw the book, I was like, how much damage can a heat wave like even do? Like, how does this even make a disaster? And then one of the first quotes that popped out to me was, heat waves receive little public attention, not only because they fail to generate the massive property damage and fantastic images produced by other weather-related disasters, but also because their victims are primarily social outcasts. So, like, I guess one of the reasons I didn't think a heat wave was a huge problem was because, like, you don't have, like, the flooded homes, like, the buildings on fire, like, forests on fire, like, it's social outcasts dying privately. Like, it's like the people you don't hear about. So like I thought that was really interesting.
And I also really like this quote because it reminded me of one of the writing prompts that we recently had or on the discussion boards. And it was talking about like why the media sometimes like portrays disasters in a certain way. And I mean, this like touches on it almost perfectly. Like, news only catches things that are eye-catching, so it has to be something like a person visibly dying or struggling. But in a heat wave, the deaths, as the author describes, are pretty slow and worn out, and like
they're not dramatic.
They're not dramatic, and they're old people and they're poor people, and they're not the group that people tend to care the most about, especially the government. I
also think too, it's interesting when you think about it. Like, all the people who died, they weren't like in the street. They weren't like none of that was televised. It was
in their house.
The stuff that was televised was like the fire hydrants, and I bet they emphasized like crime and like stuff like that. But the people who died, like their doors were locked. Like you couldn't even go in, and that's just, it's sad. But honestly, and this might be like hot take, I'm almost glad, because I think, like how we were talking about the discussion board, a lot of times the media, it's like capitalism. Like, they're literally just trying to sell views. And, like, it's almost like they died privately. But also a huge problem in the book is, like, they did die alone. And that is a problem. So it's like a double-edged sword.
And that kind of ties us into the beginning of chapter 1, which does focus a lot on the idea of being alone. And I thought something that was interesting in chapter 1 that stood out a lot to me was the idea of crime in Chicago and how that played a role in people being alone. And typically, like with the elderly,
like
who
they
were
don't want to
living
leave their houses.
They didn't want to leave their houses. They stopped interaction with pretty much anyone, and a lot of that did have to do with the crime. And there's a quote on page 55 that I thought was interesting that said, "In recent years, a number of studies have shown that older people living in violent and deteriorated urban areas tend to be more isolated and afraid of crime than those in more robust regions."
I just like, it's like the little things, like you never would have thought that like having like 3 corner stores opposed to none would be something that like people would or would not die in a heat wave.
Totally.
Like I love how it's really tedious, but I'm so appreciative that the book goes so in depth with like, let's look at this specific neighborhood and see like, because they had these features, like their residents did poorly or their residents were fine.
I was just gonna say, like, not even just the neighborhoods, but also the diversity makeup of a lot of the people who died in the heat wave. Like, I thought it was really interesting how the author talks about the difference between the black population and the Latino population, and how it was something like the statistic was like it was 2% of all Latinos, where like as the black like per population it was so much higher. And I thought that was really interesting, and like even these little things we don't even think of when it like has to do with the heat wave, like you were saying, like just all of the logistics that go into who actually ends up being the victim in this scenario.
Yeah, totally. I think too, I like how the author at the beginning of the chapter about, this is like a side note, about Little Village in North Lawndale, he said, he was like, a lot of people think that this is because of ethno-racial culture, like, oh, well, Latinos are much more likely to have stronger family ties. I was like, well, actually, there was like so many more factors that went into it. Like, it's not just that like African Americans aren't closer to their family. Like, there are so many things that went into like the foundation of their neighborhood that went into it. But also, it's really interesting older female women regularly are more likely to, it was one statistic in the book.
Were they like lonelier?
Yes.
Yeah.
But the men were twice as likely as women to die.
Yeah.
And that was super interesting. And it was even, it said that men create their social ties in the workplace.
Yeah.
Whereas women do it through like community programs and stuff like that. And so when older men retire, they basically like, and they, if they're not close with family, like my dad, he's not going to be friends with his work friends in like 30 years, you know? And so if you're not close to your family, like you really don't have, and you're widowed, like those men have no like
socialization.
Yeah, and this is what we were talking about, masculinity the other day.
Yeah.
They don't want to look for help.
Yeah.
Because like they almost see like living on their own as like a pride thing.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. Like they, not that they did it to themselves, but he like an older male in Chicago, he would never have thought like, oh, maybe I should make a friend so that when the heat wave comes, like it's just crazy.
It's these things that we don't even think of.
Yeah.
That also kind of ties into chapter 3, which made me think of like, not only did the people that were suffering most and going to suffer most, they didn't reach out to friends and family, but they also didn't reach out to the government.
Yeah.
And I thought the role that the city of Chicago played in the heat wave almost was like, it made me think of a little bit like how the CIA could have responded to 9/11, which is such a weird way of thinking about it, but I thought like, there do need to be these plans in place for when disasters happen, and unfortunately like the city of Chicago simply wasn't prepared.
Well, the thing was, the most interesting part is they did have a plan, but since they didn't recognize that it was a heat wave, they didn't even use it. Like they had a plan.
Really?
Like, yeah, it was the craziest thing. I read that little line. They had a plan. Yeah. Where'd it go? Yeah, the city health department had established a model heat emergency plan, and they failed to follow it. And then it said,
well, I was thinking of when the doctor, whose name is now slipping my mind, he had to be the one to figure out, like, to figure out how,
what
like,
the qualifications
were for people dying from heat-related things, and the fact that he had to do that himself, and that the mayor then tried to, like bash him for it and say that it wasn't legitimate is just beyond insane to me.
Well, like a really fascinating thing, and I think it's important that he focused on this, was that Chicago was going through, like, their politics was completely public relations. Yeah. And so everything they did, they wanted to, there's a quote that says, like, they wanted to erase the stigma that Chicago had developed, or the past, like, the past couple decades before that.
Oh, yeah, and it was in reference to the
DNC.
Yeah, the DNC that was coming
up.
They
wanted to beautify it. And one of the things that totally... Oh, this was really interesting. The thing about the Chicago Alternative Police... What was it called? The Chicago Alternative Police System or something?
Oh,
but it was talking about how...
SAPS?
CAPS. Yeah, CAPS, yeah. And I think this goes into also just like a current topic, like defund the police. Like, one of the reasons people advocate for defunding the police is because the police are responding to things like cats in trees and you know, like stuff that they should not, that like lessens their ability to do their job. And what's so interesting is that CAPS literally put money in so that they could do those things. Yeah. So in their own way, they almost put themselves in like harm's situation. Yeah. They put themselves in harm's way. And they were talking, they were saying, these, like, the guy went on a ride along, and he was like, the police officer he's supposed to stay in a certain area to get to know the community and to do this work. But since there's, like, Chicago crime rate is so high, like, they're just responding to calls. Like, they can't take time to meet the elderly of the community or, like, get to know. And
that reminded me about the quote where it says, like, the city supply of 56 ambulances and roughly 600 paramedics is inadequate to meet either regular exceptional demands for care. Yeah. Like, even before any of this happened,
they weren't equipped.
No, not even close. And like, if you're not even equipped on a normal day, and once a normal day in Chicago, like Chicago is one of the highest like death rates in the United States. Like, I can't even imagine when on top of that, like all of these people were dying in their houses, and people didn't even know.
Yeah, and I think too, what sucks about the whole situation, we're gonna run out of time.
Yeah, we are.
Is that it was the upper government officials who denied that it was happening, and then it was all blamed on the workers, like police officers and fire, who worked like 30-hour days. Yeah. They worked so hard, and it says like individual efforts. were amazing.
Yeah.
But the system failed. So.
Yeah, those are just a little bit of our responses to the reading.